Nvidia has a history of flat out lying in their marketing slides when they announce a new series of GPUs. So when the 4070 Super was announced and claimed faster than the RTX 3090, I instantly had a flashback to the original launch of the 40 series when I had to do a video talking about their claim that the 4090 was 2 to 4 times faster than a 3090 Ti. I titled the video RTX 4090 and 4080, the good, the bad, and the misleading. And so I didn't mean to, but I just realized I'm like picking my own nose. That's gross. Anyway, sorry. Way off topic here. So what's going on here is basically Nvidia was factoring in frame generation as if it was raw performance when making a claim like that. Now, I've talked about frame generation extensively in other videos. It doesn't make sense to count it as raw performance. It is a good feature, and if you get a high enough base frame rate, it can be a good way to double down on a high refresh rate monitor, but you already need a good foundation of performance for it to really be worthwhile from a latency and image quality perspective. So it's not the same thing as raw performance. So anyway, I was curious when we made the claim faster than a 3090 for the 4070 Super. This claim actually sounded more reasonable. And when I was in the pre-briefing for this announcement for media, the Nvidia rep did actually say this one is actually a raw performance truth. And I was curious if that would hold up in my own testing, especially if we looked at VRAM hungry games. And so in my testing here, we're going to look at the newest games. We're going to look at them at all resolutions, so 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, with and without upscaling, and with and without frame generation, with and without ray tracing, path tracing, all sorts of things, all sorts of different game engines, and let's figure out how the 4070 Super does stack up against the 3090. Again, the 3090 is a 24 gigabyte VRAM card, 4070 Super is only 12, so that's another interesting thing to take a look at. Let's go ahead, roll the benchmarks, and then I will jump in with my final thoughts at the end, although I will mention quickly, a lot of people look at my footage and they judge smoothness by the video footage. You shouldn't do that. Judge it by the frame time graphs. When you record a game that's not VSync locked at 60 FPS, it doesn't look the same as it would on a variable refresh rate display. It can look out of sync with the footage capture, judder, screen tearing, that type of thing. So again, use the frame time graph and the 1% lows to judge smoothness, not the visual appearance of the video footage. Let's roll the benchmarks. We'll start off testing with Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, and at 1080p ultra settings, we see basically a tie, but the 4070 Super is actually taking the lead by 3% in the averages and 4% in the 1% lows. Frame rates are good on both GPUs at 92 and 89 on the averages, and 74 versus 71 in the 1% lows. But this game does use a lot of VRAM, so what happens as we bump up the resolution? Well, it's unclear whether it's just memory bandwidth or VRAM. In fact, actually, more probably just the memory bandwidth. It's still basically a tie, but the 3090 does technically take the lead by 2% at 63 versus 62 in the averages, and 54 versus 53 in the 1% lows. If you look at the memory allocation and usage on the 3090, it's right at about 12. So, you know, it's borderline, but didn't seem to be causing a lot of issues. Now, you can also use DLSS at the quality setting here, and both GPUs gain a lot of performance, and now the 4070 Super regains the minor lead in what is essentially a tie at 95 versus 93, which is a 2% win in the averages, although a more meaningful 7% win in the 1% lows, although I really doubt you could tell which GPU we're using, and if you were actually just blind testing them. But what if we drop down to high settings? I was curious if we had been kind of right on the VRAM borderline, if this would help out the 4070 Super at all. But it's actually looking like it's still a win for the 3090 when we're at the native 1440p resolution. It's a 4% win at 83 versus 80 in the averages, and a 2% win in the 1% lows at 68 versus 67. Again, pretty much a tie. What if you use DLSS at the high settings? Well, now both GPUs are averaging well over 100 FPS. We're at 115 and 114 respectively. So it's really a tie, although technically almost a little less than a 1% win for the 4070 Super. But the 1% lows are a massive 1% advantage for the 3090 at 91 versus 90. So again, both GPUs are doing extremely well at high with DLSS quality, and it's a tie. But what about 4K resolution, where where it's possible we're pushing up both against the 12 gigabytes of VRAM. The 3090 is certainly allocating more than 12. And then we also have memory bandwidth advantages for the 3090, and that pushes its lead to 6% at 35 versus 33, 7% in the 1% lows at 31 versus 29, so it certainly is a win for the 3090, but not by a lot, and neither GPU would probably play at those settings. If you enable DLSS quality, both GPUs jump massively in performance, and we're now seeing 57 versus 55 average, with the advantage still for the 3090, but it's dropped to a 4% advantage. The 3090 is still showing allocation of VRAM beyond 12 gigabytes, but again, the overall performance, even in the 1% lows, we're not seeing stutters, is pretty much the same. Now, what if we drop down to the high settings at 4K resolution, but turned off upscaling? At native 4K high, we are seeing a 7% advantage for the 3090, and it is showing allocation of VRAM beyond 12 gigabytes. However, again, the advantage is 48 versus 45, 7% win in the averages, 2% in the 1% lows, 42 versus 41. So not a particularly meaningful advantage, but it is advantage 3090. If we kick on DLSS quality at the high settings at 4K, I think we're arriving more at the settings that people would probably want to actually use. And we're now seeing a 6% win for the 3090. Although both GPUs are, like I said, more at frame rate targets that make sense. 74 and 70 respectively, advantage 3090, and 62 versus 60 in the 1% lows, advantage 3090. VRAM allocation right at about 12. Let's move on to Alan Wake 2. First, we'll try it out at the high preset. The game does not have a preset beyond high unless you turn on ray tracing, and we will look at that. But all individual settings could be turned beyond this point, but I stuck to the high preset. At 1080p high, we are seeing 89 versus 85 FPS, advantage 3090, but only by 5%. In the 1% lows, it's also a 5% advantage at 62 versus 59. What if we move up to 1440p resolution? Now the 3090 extends its lead, but only to 7%. It's 64 versus 60, so both GPUs capable of playing the game at 1440p high at native resolution, and the 1% lows are 47 versus 44. Again, a 7% advantage for the 3090 in the 1% lows. But you could very well turn on DLSS. If you do that, both GPUs jump a lot in performance. We're now seeing 94 versus 90, still advantage 3090, but only by 4%. And the 1% lows are 63 versus 61. That's a 3% advantage for the 3090. Although the 40 series GPU can turn on DLSS 3 frame generation, while Nvidia has locked out the 30 series from that feature. So feature set advantage for the 4070 Super here. If we move up to 4K resolution at native 4K high settings, we are now seeing a much more meaningful advantage for the 3090. This is the first time I think I'd call something a clear win that you might actually notice. It's a 16% advantage for the 3090, but it's only 37 FPS versus 32, so I don't think these are the frame rates you'd actually be using, although it is a 22% advantage in the 1% lows at 28 versus 23. I think more likely you would kick on DLSS quality. Now, if you do that without frame generation, the 4070 Super can now hit 55 FPS, but the 3090 hits 60, giving it a 9% advantage. So less meaningful of an advantage than we saw at native resolution, but still, you know, it's one of the bigger leads we've seen. In the 1% lows, we're seeing an 8% advantage for the 3090 at 43 versus 40, but again, the 40 series GPU could use frame generation. If we turn on the path tracing mode by kicking on RT to the high preset, we interestingly now see the tables have turned. The 4070 Super is taking the lead, although it's only 39 FPS versus 35. So 11% win for the 4070 Super and 7% in the 1% lows. But not quite sure those are the frame rates that you're looking for. You can enable DLSS quality. I don't love it at 1080p, although I will say that DLSS ray reconstruction does help out a lot here and might make this something a lot of people actually might want to use. And without frame generation, the 4070 Super has a 7% lead, at 59 versus 55, and a 5% lead in the 1% lows. And we're at a decent base frame rate to frame generate off of now. So you could certainly use that on the 4070 Super. If we move up to 1440p resolution, at the, again, RT High preset and with DLSS quality enabled, which looks good at 1440p, and honestly, these GPUs can't handle it without any DLSS, we're seeing 43 versus 40 FPS. In a slow-paced game like this, you might play at these settings, I don't know. There's a lot of latency if you kick on frame generation here. It's going over 100 milliseconds. 10% lead in the 1% lows for the 4070 Super. But what if we went to performance mode upscaling? I don't love this at 1440p. If you look at the tree branches and things, I think there's a lot of shimmering and loss of detail, but it does get your frame rates up to 57 FPS on the 4070 Super, which is a decent baseline to frame generate off of. The 3090 hits 52 FPS. That gives a 10% lead to the 4070 Super in the averages, although only 3% in the 1% lows at 41 versus 40. What about trying to path trace at 4K resolution? Even with DLSS at the performance mode, we're only looking at a 32 FPS average and 31 FPS average respectively, still advantage to the 4070 Super in the averages. But honestly, I don't think you'd use these settings because the 1% lows dip into the 20s, and the 3090 actually takes the lead there. We're right up against 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so it's possible that's playing into it. The frame time graph's a lot spikier on the 4070 Super. There's one other game we can check out for path tracing here, which is Cyberpunk 2077, and at 1080p native resolution with the RT Overdrive preset. Both GPUs are kind of barely playable, averaging 40 and 42 respectively, although interestingly now the 3090 is taking the minor lead rather than the 4070 Super, which is the flip of what we saw with path tracing in Alan Wake 2, although again we're kind of grasping at very small differences here. If we kick on DLSS quality to get us to actually good frame rates, we're now tied in the averages at 76 and getting a 5% lead in the 1% lows for the 4070 Super. Although this is a decent baseline to frame generate off of, and again, I don't love upscaling at 1080p. Those palm tree branches look a little shimmery to me, but ray reconstruction does put in a lot of work here. It looks better than it did before we had that feature. If we move up to 1440p resolution with RT Overdrive mode and DLSS at the quality setting, we're definitely playable at 51 and 52 FPS respectively, 2% advantage to the 3090. They're tied at 43 in the 1% lows. This is really borderline for using frame generation, although the latency in this game overall is less than what we're seeing reported in Alan Wake 2, so some people would probably find frame generation at these frame rates usable here, and some people wouldn't. You could go down to DLSS performance mode, which does boost the averages on both GPUs to 73 FPS without frame generation, and the 4070 Super takes a minor 5% lead at 61 versus 58 in the 1% lows. We're definitely have enough headroom for frame generation now, although the palm tree branches looking pretty shimmery again. In other words, I'm not sure I'm in love with performance mode upscaling at 1440p resolution. At 4K resolution, performance mode upscaling can be acceptable. And unfortunately, it only gets our performance up to 39 and 40 respectively. Now the 3090 taking a 3% advantage. That's only 1 FPS, guys. It's like margin of error. And a 1 FPS advantage in the 1% lows at 30 versus 29. Again, I think this is probably too low of a base frame rate for frame generation for most people. You know, people seem to have different reactions to that. If we move on to one of the most popular recent games on PC with Baldur's Gate 3 at 1080p ultra settings, this time they're basically tied again, but I think now we can actually just blame CPU limitation. Neither GPU is fully utilized here if you look at the usage percentage. And so basically what we learn is that Act 3 of Baldur's Gate is CPU limited on high-end GPUs, even if you have a high-end CPU to pair it with. If we move up to 1440p ultra settings, we are still, for the most part, CPU limited, occasionally hitting the limits of the GPUs and occasionally not. So we do see a 12% advantage in the 1% lows, where we see a few stutters as we round this corner on the 3090. Sometimes that can just be kind of bad luck in the city area. I found that this engine isn't perfectly consistent on its stutters on your benchmark passes. And if we move up to 4K Ultra, we're now GPU limited. And we can see a 7% advantage for the 3090. And again, at 4K resolution, that tends to be more normal. However, the frame time graph on the 3090 did look a bit more stuttery at the beginning of the run. And that's giving the 4070 Super a more noticeable advantage in the 1% lows at 60 FPS versus 49. Let's move on to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 at 1080p basic settings, choosing those over the extreme preset for, like, you know, it's a multiplayer game. Most people turn down settings. Now we're seeing probably the most impressive generational uplift that we've seen here. The 40 series does a lot better in this game than the 30 series. I have a feeling it's due to the increased L2 cache, but anyway, we're seeing a 29% advantage for the 4070 Super, although the 3090 is still hitting a 248 FPS average. If we move up to 1440p resolution, still at the basic settings, we still see a big noticeable lead for the 4070 Super by 18% in the averages. However, you know, that did dip a bit from what we saw at 1080p resolution. So it does seem like as the resolution increases, the generational advantage for the 4070 Super does decrease, but it is still there. If we move up to 4K resolution, still at the basic preset, we've wiped out most of that advantage. The 4070 Super is now only 4% ahead, although 9% in the 1% lows, which is maybe a bit more meaningful. But in general, it's kind of really interesting to see that scaling. Like I said, my theory in this game is that the game likes cache size increases, which we did see with the 40 series, because it liked AMD's GPUs with the Infinity cache a lot more than the 30 series GPUs. But anyway, let's move on to Starfield. At 1080p ultra settings, we're seeing the GPUs, surprise, surprise, basically tied. The 1% lows are tied at 60, and the averages are 85 and 82, giving a 4% lead to the 4070 Super. Again, it is pretty much a tie. This one I don't think we can blame on CPU limitation, as we can see the GPUs pushed right up near 99% most of the time. Now, if we go up to 1440p ultra settings, the 4070 Super hits 69, nice, and the 3090 hits 66. Giving the 4070 Super a 5% lead in the averages, which is not very noticeable. And the 3090 takes a 6% lead in the 1% lows, which is also not very noticeable at 53 versus 50. So basically, they're performing about the same here. I'd call this one a tie. What if you wanted to kick on some DLSS? Well, now frame rates jump all the way up to 85 and 82 respectively, giving the 4070 Super a 4% not very noticeable advantage in the averages and a 2% 1 FPS advantage at 62 versus 61 in the 1% lows. The only real noticeable difference here, I think, is that the 40 series has access to DLSS 3 frame generation in this game, and the 3090 would have to rely on like modding in FSR 3 or something like that. Now, what if we moved up to 4K resolution? Well, as we have seen in some games, I think the increased memory bandwidth, not the VRAM, because we're not going anywhere near 12 gigabytes of VRAM here, helps out the 3090 to take a 7% lead. It's only 44 versus 41, although the 1% lows are a 12% advantage at 37 versus 33. But honestly, I don't really think this is how most people would choose to play the game, given that we do have access to DLSS. So if we kick on DLSS quality at 4K resolution, frame rates now jump to 60 and 62 respectively, the 3090 taking a 3% lead. It's only 2 FPS. I don't think you're going to notice it, although the 1% lows are a more noticeable 10% advantage at 53 versus 48. We're still pretty close in raw performance, so having access to frame generation in this game does, I think, give the most meaningful differentiator between the two GPUs in that game. Resident Evil 4 Remake at its maximum preset is one of the most VRAM-hungry games I've tested. But despite that, at least at 1080p max settings, the 4070 Super does take the advantage by 7% in the averages, although the 1% lows are tied at 121 and 122, so technically a little bit less than 1% advantage for the 3090. That's just margin of error, guys. What if we move up to 1440p resolution? Well, now we're basically tied with a 113 versus 111 average and 2% lead to the 4070 Super. In the 1% lows, it's 97 versus 98, which is a 1% lead for the 3090. The 3090 is reporting allocation beyond 12 gigabytes, but it doesn't seem to be meaningfully impacting performance. The frame time graph looks smooth. The 1% lows are tied. What about 4K resolution? At 4K resolution, it is, again, either memory bandwidth or the VRAM or both, but the 3090 does take a bit of a lead here, although it's not dramatic. It's 8% lead in the averages, 10% in the 1% lows. The averages are 71 versus 66, and then 1% lows are 64 versus 58. The frame time graph still looks very smooth on the 4070 Super, so it doesn't seem to be particularly meaningful here, at least in this short test run. Now, what if we move to Unreal Engine 5? The most demanding UE5 game I've tested is Lords of the Fallen, and at 1080p Ultra settings, both GPUs are basically tied, and the average is at 74 and 73, 1% advantage to the 4070 Super. As we round this corner, you'll see both GPUs have frame time spikes, as I think it's UE5 traversal stutter kicks in, which I think has a bigger effect on the 1% lows in the actual GPU performance, and it's 56 versus 51 in those 1% lows. If we move up to 1440p Ultra settings, neither GPU can actually hold 60 FPS at native resolution. In my testing area here, they're tied at 53. The 1% lows are also basically tied at 41 and 42 respectively. Again, you'll notice spikes on the frame time graph as we round this corner. It's very consistent behavior. So like I said, I'm pretty sure it's kind of just loading into a new zone in Unreal Engine 5. If we kick on DLSS, we'll notice that Unreal Engine 5 responds extremely well to upscaling, having our frame rates jump from below 60 to all the way up to 83 and 80 respectively. 4% advantage for the 4070 Super, 1% lows are 59 and 52, advantage 3090. Again, spikes on the frame time graph as we run round that corner. They do seem to be a bit bigger spikes on the 4070 Super. We're not hitting 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so I'm not sure we can really blame that. Maybe memory bandwidth, or maybe it's just run-to-run variance. Anyway, if we go up to 4K Ultra settings, neither GPU is doing great at native resolution. It's 30 FPS versus 29, which is a 3% advantage to the 3090. The 1% lows are also a 1 FPS gap, 25 versus 24, which is a 4% advantage to the 3090. But I don't think you'd play it that way. You'd either turn down settings or upscale or both. If we kick on DLSS quality and leave it at ultra settings, we jump all the way to 53 and 52 FPS respectively. 2% advantage for the 4090. It's a tie, guys. And the 1% lows are also a tie. 42 and 41. Technically advantage 4070 Super there by 2%, but there's not a whole lot in it. I think that's enough benchmarks. Let's move into some final thoughts. So did Nvidia lie? Is the 4070 Super faster than the RTX 3090? And I think a more accurate answer would be they have very similar performance. But let's go ahead and dig into my thoughts overall. So if we jump into it, do we see the 4070 Super beat the 3090 in some situations? Yes, we do. If we scroll through the footage though, I think what we'll notice is it's oftentimes trading blows, which one is ahead, and sometimes certain ones can take a more noticeable lead, and I think that could for the 3090's case, that happens most frequently when you're at 4K native resolution where memory bandwidth is more of a concern, as well as occasionally going right up against that 12 gigabytes of VRAM where it's possible the 4070 Super would slow down a bit beyond just memory bandwidth by having to access system memory. The biggest advantage I saw in the testing seemed to be in Alan Wake's path tracing mode for the 4070 Super, where it did seem to take a slightly more noticeable lead, although it wasn't like a commanding lead unless you count frame generation. And then the other one that stood out was Call of Duty. Call of Duty, again, my personal theory is that the engine seems to really like a large amount of cache size, which was my theory on why the 40 series does a lot better than the 30 series and did a better job of catching up to where AMD used to, smash the 30 series when it was 6,000 versus, 30 series AMD versus Nvidia, and AMD has that large infinity cache, things like that. So that's my pet theory on what's going on here, but that's the biggest advantage we were definitely seeing was like 1080p in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. And then again, you could look at the feature set differences like frame generation, which certainly is a nice option to have in a lot of cases. But again, I wouldn't count that as raw performance because it's useful to smooth out the motion on a high refresh rate display once you already have a decent baseline of performance. Now, the only other really notable things I think it might be worth talking about here is the power draw, because the 4070 Super is basically tying the performance of the 3090 at just barely over 200 watts, where the 3090 is pushing around 350 watts. By the way, both models I was testing here are Founders Edition GPUs. So if any of you are like, my 3090 boosts a lot higher, or my 4070 Super boosts a lot higher, I'm running the Founders Editions of both GPUs at their out-of-the-box settings. So that's what I'm testing here. Obviously, there's factory overclocked or manually overclocked models that would have differences in all of that. Anyway, so overall, what do I think of this claim? I think depending on the exact set of games you tested, it is possible that you could truly make that statement without factoring in frame generation. But I don't think I would say it's overall just true. And I think a generally better way of understanding this is the 4070 Super performs a lot like an RTX 3090. In most situations. The only big advantage for the 4070 Super is the lower power draw and the availability of the DLSS 3 frame generation. And the big advantage for the 3090 would be the additional VRAM if you're running settings where that's meaningful. Also, a bit more memory bandwidth at the high resolutions does seem to mean at 4K, you're more frequently advantaged for the 3090, but it's not by a lot. So I don't think there's a lot in it. Anyway, I think that's kind of my summary of my thoughts on this situation. What do you guys think? I don't think people are necessarily thinking, oh, which one should I buy? Unless you're maybe considering a used 3090 or something like that. So again, think about how much do you need that VRAM, I guess, if that's the case, and what are the prices actually looking at? Because again, the 4070 Super is coming in, actually available in stock at that $599.99 price point, which is at least good to see it holding that price so far. Anyway, it's not like the 3090 was offering the best value, performance per dollar of the 30 series anyway. But it is nice to see a now, $600 class card at least able to tie it in performance for the most part, which is pretty cool. And the efficiency difference between the generations was definitely a standout. Huge thank you to viewers and subscribers, and especially channel members who have clicked the join button to directly support the channel financially. This is the largest set of not only games and settings, but also just the sheer number of GPUs I've tested for this round of testing. As we go into next week, if you're watching this at the time of filming, we'll be seeing the 4070 Ti Super, so a ton of comparisons like this coming out for that, as well as the 4080 Super coming a week after that, tons of comparisons with those. I've benchmarked so many awesome comparison points, but this has taken a massive amount of time, so when I'm going through all of this testing, having those channel members who have clicked the join button to directly support, it is very meaningful to me to see that support, see people actually value what I'm doing here, find that useful enough. Now, I totally understand a lot of people aren't in a financial position to contribute financially to the channel. That is totally okay, and do not feel any pressure to do that. But just huge thank you to people who have, and I hope everyone has an amazing day. I usually say excellent day. Has an excellent day.